Now, as a fighter, Steve McQueen, now he is good in that department because that son of a gun got the toughness.
He was declared broke the year he died. That was the headline in 1980, and for decades it stuck. But the truth buried beneath that obituary was almost the opposite. Steve McQueen had spent his entire adult life quietly building something far larger than his paychecks, and it would take his family years to fully understand what he had actually left behind. To understand the fortune, you have to understand the man who built it, and that starts long before Hollywood ever knew his name. Terrence Stephen McQueen was born in Indianapolis in 1930, to a mother who struggled to raise him and a father who left before he could form a memory of him. By his teenage years he was in and out of trouble, eventually landing at the Boys Republic Reform School in Chino, California, a place he would later credit, not resent, for teaching him discipline. He joined the Marine Corps as a young man, clashed constantly with authority, and spent time in the brig for going AWOL. None of that reads like the origin story of a man who would one day negotiate multi-million-dollar film deals. But that hardness became his currency. When he finally broke into acting in the late 1950s, first on television in Wanted, Dead or Alive, and then on the big screen, audiences responded to something that felt unmanufactured. He was not playing tough. He simply was. By the 1960s, McQueen was one of the highest-paid actors in the world, carried by The Great Escape, The Magnificent Seven and Bullet, the 1968 film whose San Francisco car chase, shot largely with McQueen himself behind the wheel, reset what audiences expected from action cinema. What most fans did not see was the businessman operating behind the persona. McQueen understood, earlier than most of his peers, that fame was a depreciating asset unless it was converted into something durable. In 1968, negotiating for the Thomas Crown affair, he pushed for an enormous upfront fee for the era. A few years later, on the towering Inferno, he secured a share of the back-end profits rather than settling for a flat salary, a decision that reportedly earned him more than his original fee many times over. He was also known, according to multiple biographers including Marshall Terrill, author of Steve McQueen, Portrait of an American Rebel, for charging significant money simply to read a script, win or lose the role. While the industry saw a temperamental star who showed up late and rewrote his own contracts, McQueen was quietly doing something almost nobody in Hollywood was doing at that scale, converting cash into physical assets that would only grow scarcer and more valuable with time. He collected motorcycles by the dozens, favoring Triumphs, Huskies, and vintage American and British Marques, many of them stored on remote properties in California and New Mexico rather than displayed for cameras. He bought historic race cars, including a Jaguar XKSS and a Porsche 917K, the same model class he raced in the 1971 film Le Mans, a project he financed partly out of his own pocket because he believed in it more than the studios did. He bought land in places far from the cameras, ranches and quiet acreage that had nothing to do with publicity and everything to do with permanence. He was not living like a man planning to die broke. He was living like a man who understood that objects tied to authenticity only appreciate once the person behind them is gone. That understanding proved prophetic, but not in time to change the story the public was told at his death. In late 1979, McQueen was diagnosed with pleural mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer linked to asbestos exposure, likely from insulation used on Marine Corps ships and racing suits lined with asbestos fiber earlier in his career. He pursued unconventional treatment in Mexico, including Laetrile therapy that was not approved in the United States, and traveled to Juarez in late 1980 for surgery to remove an abdominal tumor. He died there on November 7, 1980, at 50 years old, hours after the operation. In the immediate aftermath, reporting suggested his estate was worth only around $2 to $6 million, a modest figure for a man who had commanded some of the largest paychecks in the industry, and the assumption at the time was that medical bills and years of expensive tastes had eaten through his wealth. That figure, though, only reflected liquid, easily appraised assets at the moment of death. It did not and could not account for what those motorcycles, cars, watches, and image rights would become worth once collectors and licensors began competing for anything connected to his name. McQueen had signed his will in January 1979, nearly 2 years before his death, and it was specific in ways that shaped everything that followed. His 2 children from his first marriage, to actress and dancer Neile Adams, were named the primary beneficiaries, his son Chad McQueen and his daughter Terry McQueen. Neile Adams herself, despite having been married to him for 16 years and raising both of his children largely on her own during his rise to fame, was left nothing in the will. In her own memoir, My Husband, My Friend, Adams wrote candidly about the complicated end of their marriage and the years that followed, describing a relationship that had shaped McQueen's early career far more than the public record credited. Barbara Minty, McQueen's third wife, whom he married only months before his death, received personal effects and mementos but not a significant financial stake in the estate, a detail that surprised some at the time given how close the couple had been in his final year. Minty later co-authored, with biographer Marshall Terrill, Steve McQueen, The Last Mile, a book documenting his final months, and she remained a public custodian of his story for decades afterward, even as her financial share of the estate stayed modest compared to what her stepchildren eventually controlled. Court records and later reporting also noted a detail that reveals how deliberately McQueen structured his affairs. His will contained language addressing any children who might come forward later, a clause that closed the door on future paternity claims from outside his two acknowledged children. Over the years, a small number of such claims did surface publicly, none of them ultimately altering the distribution of the estate, a reminder that even a private man understood the value of tying up loose ends before he was no longer there to answer for them himself. The real transformation of McQueen's legacy happened slowly, through the 1990s and 2000s, as a nostalgia economy built around vintage masculinity and analog cool began to take shape, and McQueen's image fit it perfectly. Barbour, the British outerwear brand, built a now famous marketing campaign around a single archival photograph of McQueen wearing one of their international jackets, turning a decades-old picture into one of the most cited examples of celebrity licensing in fashion history. Tag Heuer reintroduced the Monaco watch McQueen wore in Le Mans, leaning entirely on that cinematic association to relaunch a model that had gone largely dormant. Ford repeatedly revived the Bullitt Mustang, releasing special editions tied explicitly to McQueen's chase scene decades after the film's release. And the collectibles market did the rest. The actual green Mustang GT390 driven in Bullitt, thought lost for years before resurfacing, sold at a Mecum auction in January 2020 for $3.74 million. A record for any Mustang ever sold and a number that would have seemed unthinkable to the estate handling his affairs in 1980. His personal Porsche 911S, along with other cars and motorcycles tied directly to his ownership, have since traded hands at auction houses like Bonhams and Mecum for sums that routinely run into the hundreds of thousands and, in the case of his most historically significant vehicles, into the millions. Eyewear brand Persol built an entire advertising identity around his image decades after his death, and companies producing watches, denim, and motorcycle apparel continue to pay for the rights to associate themselves with his likeness, each deal adding another layer to an income stream that did not exist in any meaningful form when he died. Managing all of this fell largely to Chad McQueen, who spent much of his adult life protecting his father's name, licensing it carefully rather than flooding the market, pursuing companies that used the McQueen image without authorization, and helping shape official partnerships with brands like Porsche and Persol. He built his own career as an actor and later as a businessman connected to the automotive and eyewear world, and by most accounts approached the family legacy with a mix of pride and vigilance, understanding that scarcity, not saturation, was what kept the McQueen brand valuable. Chad McQueen died in September 2024, and with his passing, a significant portion of that stewardship shifted further to the next generation. Terry McQueen, Steve's daughter, had chosen a quieter path, working behind the scenes in the film industry before her death in 1998 following complications from a liver transplant. Her share of the family's interests passed to her daughter, Molly McQueen, an actress who has continued to be involved in projects connected to her grandfather's image and legacy, representing the family's third generation to draw both meaning and income from a name that never stopped working, even after the man behind it was gone. What makes the Steve McQueen story different from so many posthumous Hollywood fortunes is that none of it appears to have been engineered as a plan. He did not talk about branding. He did not sit for interviews about legacy management or long-term wealth strategy. By every account from those who knew him, he was a private, guarded man who distrusted attention and preferred motorcycles and open desert to premieres and press junkets. Yet that very instinct, the refusal to overexpose himself, to sell every moment, turned out to be the most valuable business decision he never consciously made. Scarcity became the foundation of value. The less available he made himself while alive, the more the world wanted a piece of him once he was gone. There is something quietly instructive in that, beyond the auction totals and licensing figures. McQueen spent his life being told he was difficult, unreliable, hard to work with. Producers tolerated him because he sold tickets, not because they understood him. But the instincts that frustrated Hollywood, his refusal to be packaged, his preference for authenticity over performance, are the same instincts that let his name outlive nearly every one of his contemporaries in commercial terms. His family did not inherit a simple pile of money. They inherited a set of choices he made about how to live, and it turned out those choices were worth more than any single paycheck he ever cashed. Steve McQueen spent his career being called the King of Cool. What his estate proved, decades after his death, is that the coolness was never the performance. It was the discipline underneath it, and that discipline is still paying dividends to a family he never got the chance to watch grow old. Perhaps that is the part of the story worth sitting with longest. A man who trusted almost no one, who grew up believing he could rely only on himself, ended up building a legacy that depended entirely on other people carrying it forward without him. A son who spent decades defending his name, a daughter who quietly stepped back and let her own daughter inherit the responsibility, a widow who chose to tell his story honestly rather than let it fade, and a first wife who lived long enough to watch the man who left her nothing become worth more than either of them could have imagined. The fortune Steve McQueen left behind was never just about the cars in the barns or the watches in the vaults. It was about what happens when authenticity outlives the person who lived it, and about a family that, for all its quiet grief and unequal shares, found itself bound together by the same thing that made him famous in the first place, a name that refused to be forgotten.